Bullying doesn't always leave bruises, but it always leaves scars. Maybe it's harsh words online, constant criticism at work, or quiet attacks from people who should have had your back. If you're tired of feeling small, confused, or powerless, you're not alone and you're not without hope. In this video, you'll discover 4 biblical responses to bullying that actually work, practical God-centered ways to protect your heart, stand your ground, and reclaim your worth without becoming bitter or broken. Bullying has a way of shrinking your world. Sometimes it's obvious someone uses size, status, or strength to intimidate you. Other times it's quieter and more cutting sarcasm, humiliation, constant jokes, gossip, screenshots, comments, cold shoulders, or that slow drip of criticism that makes you question yourself. And what hurts the most is how bullying can show up in places that were supposed to be safe. A lot of people think bullying is just a school thing, but if you've lived long enough, you know it's not. It can come from classmates, sure, but it can also come from co-workers, bosses, extended family, in-laws, and yes, even people at church or in leadership. That's one of the hardest parts. You expect the world to be messy. You don't expect the people who preach love to treat you like a target. And if I had to describe what's going on inside a bully, most of the time, it looks like this insecurity wearing a costume. They're trying to feel powerful, so they look for someone they can push down. They find value in humiliating you because it gives them a temporary sense of control. It doesn't excuse them, but it explains the pattern. If you're in the middle of that right now, if you're being mocked, singled out, excluded, or attacked, please hear me. You don't have to pretend it's fine. You don't have to just be tougher. And you definitely don't have to accept it as your normal. In this series, I want to walk you through 4 biblical responses to bullying that actually work. Not fluffy advice. Not just ignore it. Real steps that protect your heart, keep you grounded, and help you respond with courage and wisdom. Before we get into step 1, I want to make a quick point that's connected to something many of us don't even think about. Bullying doesn't only happen face-to-face anymore. Online, there are platforms, websites, and sometimes even internet providers collecting data, tracking behavior, and building profiles, often without you really feeling like you have a choice. And I'll be honest, that kind of constant surveillance can feel like a digital version of being followed, watched, and leveraged. It's not the same as personal bullying, but it can carry that same invasive feeling like your space isn't really yours. That's why a lot of people use tools like a VPN to add privacy and protection when they browse, especially if you're online a lot for work, school, or content. And if you have a sponsor message here for your channel, this is a natural place to drop it. All right, let's shift into the heart of the message. Step 1, don't let people define your worth. One of the first things bullying tries to steal is your identity. It starts with words. You're weird. You're too much. No one likes you. You're not good enough. And if you hear something long enough, especially from multiple people, you begin to wonder if it's true. That's how bullying moves from being something happening to you into becoming a label you carry. But Scripture gives us a powerful picture of what it looks like to be misunderstood, dismissed, and spoken down to. In Matthew chapter 13, verses 55 through 57, Jesus returns to the place where he grew up. He teaches with wisdom, and instead of receiving it, the people start tearing him down with familiarity. Isn't this the carpenter's son? They start listing his family members like that somehow proves he can't be who he says he is. And the passage says they took offense at him. That detail matters. Jesus did good. He brought truth. And people were still offended. Not because he did something wrong, but because his light exposed something in them. And in that offense, they tried to reduce him. They tried to put him back in a box. If you've ever experienced bullying, that moment might feel painfully familiar. Sometimes people don't attack you because you're evil. They attack you because you're different, or growing, or confident, or simply because you're an easy target and they're hungry for control. And what did Jesus do? He didn't spiral. He didn't chase validation. He didn't let their opinions rewrite his purpose. He kept moving forward. That's the lesson. Other people's offense is not your identity. I learned this the hard way, in a smaller, everyday kind of scenario. Years ago, someone kept making comments about the way I spoke, little jabs always disguised as humor. At first, I laughed along because I didn't want to be sensitive. But after a while, I noticed I was speaking less in group settings. I was editing myself. I was shrinking. And one day I realized I wasn't being shaped by God's voice anymore. I was being shaped by their ridicule. That's what bullying does when it goes unchecked. It can pull you into a dark place, You start feeling unworthy of love, undeserving of respect, like you're lucky anyone tolerates you. And if you're not careful, you can become someone else's punching bag simply because you've accepted the lie that you're supposed to be. So let me say it clearly, in a way I wish someone had said to me sooner. Your value does not drop because someone treats you poorly. Your worth does not shrink because someone is loud. And what they say or do to you does not define who you are. If someone takes offense at you, learn to move forward like Jesus did. Don't let their bitterness become your mirror. Don't let their words become your name. Your identity is given by God, not assigned by a bully. And with that foundation in place, step 2 becomes much easier, because it shifts how you see the person hurting you without minimizing what they're doing. Step 2. Consider God's bigger perspective about people. Once you stop letting people define your worth, the next challenge is even harder: how you see them. Because when someone is hurting you, mocking you, or actively trying to tear you down, the most natural response is anger, or bitterness, or the quiet decision to emotionally shut down and write them off completely. And honestly, that reaction makes sense. Pain creates walls. Self-protection is human. But Scripture keeps inviting us to lift our eyes higher, not to excuse harm, but to see people the way God sees them. In Acts chapter 8, verse 3, we're introduced to Saul before he becomes the Apostle Paul. And this version of Saul is terrifying. The text says he was ravaging the church, going house to house, dragging men and women out and throwing them into prison. This wasn't teasing. This wasn't verbal harassment. This was violent persecution. If we're being honest, Saul wasn't just a bully. He was far worse. He destroyed families. He created fear. Wherever he went, believers scattered. And yet this is the part that changes everything. God did not look at Saul and say that one is beyond redemption. Instead, Jesus confronted him. He interrupted his path. And Saul didn't just stop persecuting Christians, he became one of the strongest voices for the gospel. That doesn't erase what Saul did, but it reveals something crucial. God sees more than behavior. He sees potential brokenness and the possibility of transformation. And that perspective matters when you're dealing with people who hurt you. Now let me be clear, this is not a call to tolerate abuse. This is not permission for someone to keep harming you emotionally or physically. God does not ask you to pretend evil is good or stay silent when boundaries are being violated. But what Scripture does call us to is remembering that the person in front of us is not just their worst actions. Jesus says it plainly in Matthew chapter 5, verse 44. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you. That verse sounds beautiful until you're the one being used. And yet Jesus didn't just preach that standard, he lived it. On the cross, surrounded by people responsible for his death, he prayed for their forgiveness. Not because they deserved it, but because love was stronger than their hatred. I'll admit this is one of the hardest teachings in the Bible for me personally. There was a season when someone consistently undermined me. Subtle comments, dismissive looks, little power plays that made me dread certain rooms. I remember praying not for their good, but for my escape. And eventually I realized my prayers were full of fear, but empty of trust. When I finally brought that person honestly before God, not pretending I was okay, not hiding my anger, I felt something shift. God didn't minimize what they were doing, but he also didn't let me stay trapped in resentment. He reminded me that bitterness gives bullies free rent in your soul. Praying for someone who hurts you doesn't mean you approve of their behavior. It means you refuse to let their darkness dictate your heart. When you talk to God about people who put you down, you're inviting him to show you what he sees. Sometimes that leads to compassion. Sometimes it leads to clarity. And sometimes it leads to firm boundaries you didn't realize you were allowed to set. Because here's the truth, seeing someone through God's perspective doesn't always mean staying close to them. Sometimes it means stepping back with wisdom. Distance can be loving. Boundaries can be holy. But when you remember that God desires even broken people to be redeemed, it keeps you from becoming hard in the wrong ways. It keeps you from turning pain into cruelty. It keeps your spirit free even when circumstances are not. And there's another quiet benefit to this perspective. It protects you. When you understand that someone's cruelty often flows from insecurity, fear, or unresolved wounds, their words lose some of their power. You stop internalizing what was never meant to define you. You stop assuming their voice carries authority. You realize something important: hurt people, but healed people don't have to carry that damage forward. That doesn't mean reconciliation always happens. It doesn't mean trust is automatic. But it does mean your heart stays aligned with God, not shaped by bitterness. So if someone is bullying you right now, I want to challenge you to do something uncomfortable, but freeing: talk to God honestly about them. Tell him what they've done. Tell him how it's affected you. And then ask him, how do you want me to respond? Because loving your enemies doesn't make you weak. It makes you anchored. And once your heart is anchored, once you understand your worth and see people through God's bigger lens, you're finally ready for the next step. The step that surprises some people. The one that reminds us that faith does not mean passivity. Step 3. Be ready to defend yourself. There's a misunderstanding that floats around in Christian spaces, one that does real damage if we're not careful. It's the idea that being Christ-like means being passive. That faith means you quietly absorb harm. That turning the other cheek somehow requires you to stay in unsafe situations and let people keep hurting you. That idea is not biblical. Scripture shows us something far more balanced: courage paired with wisdom, peace paired with preparation. A powerful example of this comes from Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 18, which says that each builder working on the wall had a sword strapped at his side while he built. One hand worked, the other stayed ready. To understand why that matters, we need a little context. Israel had once been a strong kingdom, but after years of rebellion, God allowed them to be conquered by Babylon. The people were taken into exile for 70 years. Eventually, God moved to restore them, but restoration required rebuilding. The temple needed repair. The city walls had to go back up. Nehemiah was the leader God raised up for that task, and almost immediately opposition followed. As Nehemiah and his people worked, surrounding enemies mocked them, threatened them, and began plotting real attacks. These weren't empty words. These were people preparing violence. And Nehemiah didn't respond by pretending it wasn't happening. He got strategic. He split the workers into groups. Some focused on construction, others focused on defense. And even those building kept weapons nearby, not because they wanted conflict, but because they refused to be caught unprepared. That detail matters for anyone dealing with bullying today, because sometimes the godliest response is not silence, it's action. If someone is verbally or emotionally bullying you, being ready to defend yourself might look like setting clear boundaries. It might mean documenting behavior. It might mean having hard conversations instead of avoiding them. It might mean involving authority teachers, supervisors, church leadership before the situation escalates. If someone is physically threatening you, being ready may involve learning self-defense, removing yourself from dangerous environments, or seeking immediate help. And Scripture supports this kind of wisdom. God's people are never called to be passive victims. That truth can be uncomfortable, especially if you were raised to believe that standing up for yourself is somehow unspiritual. But Nehemiah shows us something different. Preparation is not a lack of faith. It's stewardship. I remember a moment when this hit home for me. A friend was dealing with relentless workplace bullying. Nothing dramatic at first, just constant belittling comments and public embarrassment. They kept praying for it to stop, hoping the person would change. But months went by, and nothing shifted. Eventually, someone asked a simple question: who else knows this is happening? The answer was no one. Once leadership was informed, patterns became clear. Accountability followed. The situation changed, not overnight, but decisively. And the turning point wasn't a miracle moment. It was preparation and courage working together. That's exactly what Nehemiah modeled. Notice something else: Nehemiah didn't do this alone. He surrounded himself with guards, watchmen, and a support system. That's another crucial lesson. Standing firm does not mean standing solo. Bullies often rely on isolation. They want you to feel like it's just you. That if you speak up, you'll be dismissed. That if you ask for help, you'll be labeled difficult or weak. But isolation is where bullying thrives, and community is where it loses power. If you're facing ongoing bullying, identify safe people you can bring into the situation. Trusted friends, mentors, authority figures, counselors. You are not meant to carry this by yourself. And yes, sometimes being ready to defend yourself includes physical preparation. Not because you're looking for a fight, but because you value your safety and the safety of others. Even then, Scripture is clear. Violence is always a last resort. Defense is about protection, not revenge. Nehemiah didn't arm his people so they could attack. He armed them so they could continue building without fear. That's the heart of this step. Defending yourself is not about becoming aggressive. It's about refusing to let intimidation stop you from doing what God has called you to do. It's about staying grounded, aware, and prepared while continuing to live, work, and love with integrity. When you know your worth, see people through God's perspective, and take wise steps to protect yourself, something powerful happens. Fear starts losing its grip, and once fear loosens, you're free to look beyond yourself. Because the final step in responding to bullying isn't just about surviving. It's about becoming the kind of person who makes bullying harder to exist in the first place. That's where we're headed next. Part 4 of 5. Step 4, stand up for the weak. If the first 3 steps are about protecting your heart, your mind, and your safety, this 4th step is about something bigger than you. Because bullying doesn't survive in environments where people refuse to look the other way. Jesus makes this unmistakably clear in Matthew chapter 25, verse 40, when he says, "Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." That statement is heavy. It means how we treat the vulnerable isn't just a social issue, it's a spiritual one. In that passage, Jesus describes the final judgment. He paints the picture of a king seated in glory, separating people like a shepherd separates sheep from goats. And what determines the separation isn't status, talent, or religious language. It's compassion in action. The righteous are shocked. They ask, "When did we do all of that?" And Jesus tells them that every time they fed the hungry, welcomed the outsider, or cared for someone in need, they were actually serving him. That matters when we talk about bullying, because bullies almost always follow the same script. They look for someone vulnerable, someone isolated, someone unsure of themselves. They apply pressure through fear or shame. And they depend on one thing to keep going: silence from the people watching. Classrooms, offices, churches, online spaces. The environment changes, but the pattern doesn't. Bullying thrives when good people stay quiet. I want to be honest here. I didn't grow up being bullied in a dramatic way. I mostly kept my head down and did my own thing. But years later, when I was teaching at a private middle school, I saw it from the other side, and it changed me. One day I was called in because a student had been reported for bullying. The things he said to another student were cruel words meant to humiliate and break her down. When I heard what had been said, something in me snapped. Not anger in a reckless way, but a deep sense that this couldn't be ignored. We gathered witnesses. We confirmed what happened. And then another teacher and I confronted the situation head on. We didn't excuse it. We didn't minimize it. We addressed it clearly. And afterward, we made sure the student who was targeted was okay. That moment reminded me of something important. Sometimes the most Christ-like thing you can do is intervene. Standing up for the weak doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as saying, "That's not okay." Sometimes it's sitting next to the person everyone avoids. Sometimes it's reporting behavior others are afraid to name. And sometimes it's using your authority, whatever level of authority you have, to protect someone who doesn't have the power to protect themselves. Scripture repeatedly reveals God's heart for the vulnerable. He defends the orphan, the widow, the stranger, the ones society overlooks or exploits. And when believers reflect that, heart bullying loses oxygen. Because here's the truth: bullies are far less powerful when they're exposed. They rely on bystanders who are uncomfortable but silent. They rely on environments where people value peacekeeping over justice. But when even one person decides to step in, the dynamic shifts. And I know the fear that comes with this. What if they turn on me next? What if I make things worse? What if I'm misunderstood? Those are real concerns. Standing up for others costs something, but so does staying silent. Silence communicates something too, even when we don't intend it to. It tells the victim you're on your own. It tells the bully this is working. And Jesus calls us to something better. Standing up for the weak doesn't mean you act recklessly. It doesn't mean you confront without wisdom. It means you refuse to let harm go unanswered when you're in a position to help. Sometimes that means looping in leadership. Sometimes it means documenting patterns. Sometimes it means checking in privately with someone who's hurting and letting them know they're not invisible. And sometimes, especially in faith communities, it means modeling a culture where protection is normal, not awkward. When people feel protected, something powerful happens. Safety restores dignity. It rebuilds trust. It creates space for healing. I still remember teachers and mentors who made me feel safe growing up. Not because they were perfect, but because they showed up. They noticed. They intervened when things crossed a line. That sense of safety stays with you longer than most sermons ever will. And that's part of our calling as believers. There's a quote often attributed to Edmund Burke that says, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing." Whether or not he actually said it, the truth behind it is undeniable. When you protect someone else, you're communicating something deeper than support. You're communicating value. You're communicating dignity. You're communicating, sometimes without words, that Jesus sees them, loves them, and has not abandoned them. And that brings us to the final part of this series. Because once you understand these 4 responses, the question becomes, what kind of presence do you want to be in the world? That's where we'll end. Becoming a place of safety. If there's one thread running through everything we've talked about, it's this: bullying loses its power when people feel protected. Not invincible, not untouched, but protected. There's a kind of comfort that comes from knowing someone has your back. That if things cross a line, you're not alone. That your dignity matters enough for someone to step in. And that sense of safety, when it's real, changes how people walk through the world. I still remember teachers and mentors who created that kind of space for me. They weren't flashy. They didn't give long speeches about justice. They simply noticed when something wasn't right and acted. Looking back, those moments mattered more than they probably realized. They communicated something deep without ever saying it out loud. You matter here. That's the kind of presence Jesus calls his followers to become. When we look back at the 4 responses we've covered, they form a complete picture, not just of how to survive bullying, but how to push back against it in meaningful ways. First, don't let people define your worth. Your identity comes from God, not from the loudest or cruelest voice in the room. What others say about you does not rewrite who you are. Second, consider God's bigger perspective about people. That doesn't mean excusing harm. It means refusing to let bitterness shape your heart. God sees brokenness potential and the possibility of redemption even in people who hurt others. Third, be ready to defend yourself. Faith is not passivity. Wisdom involves preparation, boundaries, and sometimes taking practical steps to protect yourself and others. You are not called to be a perpetual victim. Fourth, stand up for the weak. Bullying depends on silence. When believers intervene, speak up, and protect the vulnerable, the entire environment changes. But here's where it all comes together. These steps aren't just about reacting to bullying. They're about shaping culture. When people consistently see boundaries upheld, compassion modeled, and courage practiced, bullying becomes harder to sustain. Not impossible, but harder. And that matters. One of the most powerful things you can ask yourself is this: what do people feel when they're around me? Do they feel smaller or safer? Do they feel judged or seen? Do they feel alone or supported? That question isn't meant to shame. It's meant to clarify. Because even if you've been hurt, even if you're still healing, you still have the ability to be a source of safety for someone else. Sometimes the people who protect others best are the ones who know what it feels like to be unprotected. And here's something important to remember. Being a safe person doesn't mean you never confront. It means when you do it with the goal of protection, not dominance. It means you don't ignore harm for the sake of comfort. And it means you're willing to act when it costs you convenience or approval. That kind of courage reflects Jesus more clearly than any argument ever could. There's a reason moments of protection stay with people for decades. When someone steps in, speaks up, or simply refuses to abandon you, it leaves a mark. It rebuilds trust in humanity. Sometimes it even reopens trust in God. And that's not an exaggeration. For many people, their view of God is shaped less by theology and more by how his people treated them when they were vulnerable. Protection preaches a sermon without words. So if you find yourself in a position right now or someday to help someone who's being bullied, dismissed, or targeted, don't underestimate the impact of your response. You may not fix everything. You may not say it perfectly. But showing up matters. To anyone watching who's currently being bullied, I want to speak directly to you for a moment. What's happening to you is not a reflection of your worth. You are not weak for being affected. And you are not wrong for wanting safety. God sees you. And he cares deeply about how you're being treated. You are allowed to seek help. You are allowed to set boundaries. You are allowed to protect yourself. And you are not alone, even when it feels like you are. To those who have the power to intervene, teachers, leaders, parents, co-workers, friends, your presence matters more than you know. Choosing to act even quietly can interrupt harm and restore dignity in ways that echo far beyond the moment. There's a line often quoted that says, "The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing." Whether or not the wording is exact, the principle is clear. Goodness requires movement. So let's be people who move wisely, compassionately, courageously. People who refuse to let cruelty go unchecked. People who protect the vulnerable. People who remind others through action that they are loved. Because when you do that, you're not just resisting bullying. You're reflecting Jesus. Bullying may try to silence you, shrink you, or make you feel alone, but it doesn't get the final word. Your worth is secure. Your voice matters, and God's heart is always for protection, truth, and courage. whether you're learning to stand your ground or becoming a safe place for someone else. Small steps done with love can change more than you realize. If this message encouraged you or helped put words to what you've been feeling, consider giving the video a like and subscribing. It helps this channel reach others who need hope too.